hope you're ready for this video because it's gonna be a long one with a lot of information, so bring some snacks, yeah. Hey Spuds, it's Jamie, welcome back to another video, first video on the channel, I don't know, but welcome either way. I'm very glad to have you here, and today we are gonna be having an in-depth discussion breaking down the concept of rapid onset gender dysphoria, or ROGD for short. As an intro for anybody new here or just anybody not aware, I am a transgender man. I also have a PhD in psychology where I looked into the development and well-being of trans people, and I feel like that is relevant to say because this video is all about discussing and breaking down a piece of research. I recommend buckling up for this one because we're going to go in depth, having a deep dive into the flaws, the inaccuracies and the biases of Lisa Littman's 2018 research on rapid onset gender dysphoria. I really hope that this video will give you the tools and the information necessary to break down this concept if you need to. I hope you don't ever need to, but just in case, and to also highlight the many flaws and just why the concept of rapid onset gender dysphoria is so wrong and so damaging. This is a topic I've been wanting to talk about for such a long time. I mean, the research was first done 5 years ago now, and I've wanted to discuss it ever since, but I wanted to wait until I could really give this video the time it deserves and really do it properly. So here we go. There's a lot to unpack, and for something so poorly and incorrectly done and something so inaccurate, it has caused so much damage, so much potentially irreversible damage, pun intended if you get the reference. So, best place to start with this video is a definition. What is rapid onset gender dysphoria? In short, ROGD is a proposed subtype of suddenly appearing gender dysphoria that occurs during or after puberty. It's believed to be caused by peer influence and social contagion. It can also be referred to as the false belief that you can catch being trans. The research was conducted by Lisa Littman, who at the time was an assistant professor at the ICAD School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. I hope I pronounced that right. She was initially trained in preventative medicine and public health, and in obstetrics and gynecology. Her experience was in providing reproductive health care to teens and women. It has been stated that she has no personal experience or training with working with transgender youth, or at least she didn't at the time she conducted the initial piece of research. I don't know if she now has developed any direct formal training or experience with working directly with transgender youth. Her publications indicate potentially not, and I couldn't find evidence that she does, but I also couldn't find any confirmation that she doesn't, so we're going to leave that one open-ended. She's now currently the president for an organisation called the Institute for Comprehensive Gender Dysphoria Research. Yep. An organisation that someone called Michael Bailey is also involved in, who is a strong proponent of autogynephilia. There are a limited number of publications noted on the website involving the 5 people who seem to be officially involved with this organisation. Given the name, it sounds like a very official organisation and like it would be the holy grail of all information on gender dysphoria. But the output of publication seems to focus on ROGD, parent reports around ROGD and other things, detransitioners, and with no apparent direct research on actual trans people. Nothing wrong with doing some research on detransitioners and whatnot, but I don't think it can be the Comprehensive Institute of Gender Dysphoria Research if it doesn't actually conduct research on the people who are experiencing gender dysphoria themselves. Multiple of the papers, and there aren't a huge amount to begin with, are not even research papers involving any participants. This makes it a little difficult to understand how it is a comprehensive institute for gender dysphoria research, when there's very little actual research going on and seemingly nothing involving trans people. Anyway, I wanted to give that as a little bit of background. Now we're going to pop back to 2018 to talk about the original piece of research on rapid onset gender dysphoria. So as a quick overview, the original research paper was called Parent Reports of Adolescents and Young Adults Perceived to Show Signs of Rapid Onset Gender Dysphoria. The original research required heavy edits, so I'll be discussing it from the perspective of what the original paper said and how that was changed with the corrections. I'll then go into the limitations of the research, criticisms, and the impact it's had, before finishing off with the real results on gender dysphoria and rapid onset gender dysphoria, and the truth about transgender youth and adolescents. So to kick us off, the original versus the corrected paper. The original purpose was described as a way to document and explore parental observations of their child's apparent ROGD and their increased social media use and friendship groups. The purpose was also stated as describing the resulting presentation of gender dysphoria, which is inconsistent with existing research literature, apparently. The correction pulled back on those statements about social media use. use. And the purpose was adjusted to not be about describing the resulting presentation of gender dysphoria, but instead to collect parental observations around apparent, sudden, or rapid onset gender dysphoria, and then develop hypotheses around contributing factors towards this apparent rapid onset. There are already obvious flaws here, big things that were changed in simply how the purpose was presented of this study, but we'll go through what's bad about it once we've done the full summary comparison. So it was a survey-based study posted on 3 websites for targeted participant recruitment: Fourth Wave Now, Transgender Trend, and Youth Trans Critical Professionals. That's a very strange title to me for somewhere, but yes, those were the 3 websites that this was placed. I believe it was placed in another Facebook group, but there's no way of gaining access to that because it's private, but these were the main places targeted for participant recruitment. The corrected methods were expanded to include the actual website names of where the survey link was placed, and emphasized right at the start that this is a descriptive, exploratory study. Information on what constituted an eligible participant was also included in the corrected methods, and eligible participants were parents who observed a rapid or sudden onset of gender dysphoria in their children that had started during or after puberty. The results sections were very similar in both versions because results sections in abstracts are just reporting on the numbers primarily. But there were instances in the corrected version where it made it clear that these results were based on parental observations. For example, in the original results, it states, in 36.8% of the friendship groups described, the majority of the members became transgender identified. In the corrected version, this was changed to, in 36.8% of the friendship groups described, parent participants indicated that the majority of the members became transgender identified. Just pairs back those results and makes it obvious where it's coming from in an attempt to stop the over-interpretation of these results. But if you're interested, the overall results as described in the corrected version were 256 parents completed the survey, 83% of kids were AFAB, assigned female at birth, with a mean age of 15.2 when they came out as transgender. Parents described just over a third of the friendship groups as having a majority of transgender members. Around half of the parents reported subjective declines in their child's mental health and the parent-child relationship since their child came out. Around a quarter of parents said their children showed distrust towards cisgender people and stopped spending time with their cisgender friends. Shocking. I wonder why that happened. The half-ish of children were reported as trying to isolate themselves from family and only trusting info about gender dysphoria from transgender sources. I will just do a little comment now. Sorry, the main bulk of the comments will come very soon, but just a little one. These results, the results of isolation from family, distrust, not talking to some cisgender friends anymore, all of this is so blindingly obviously most likely down to rejection from these people, or knowledge that they were anti-trans in some way. Finally, over 86% of parents said their child had either had an increase in their social media use, belonged to a friendship group where one or more people were also trans, or both. Honestly, as a trans person myself who came out as a teenager and knows and is friends with many other trans people, this all makes sense. It's not about influence, it's not about social contagion, it's all about finding people who support you and finding solidarity and safety within those groups. It's been interpreted the wrong way round. Ah yes, having a transgender friend makes you transgender, rather than, oh hey, people who realize they're trans tend to gravitate towards each other because they share values and they find safety with each other. So what were the conclusions drawn from the survey results to 250 parents recruited from Fourth Wave Now, Transgender Trend, and Youth Trans Critical Professionals? I really wonder. This is the section that differs quite substantially between the original paper and the corrected version. The original paper made some conclusions about ROGD and the existence of it, stating that ROGD describes a phenomenon where the development of gender dysphoria is observed to begin suddenly during or after puberty in an adolescent or young adult who would not have met the criteria for gender dysphoria in childhood. It further claimed that ROGD appears to represent a distinct entity from gender dysphoria observed in individuals who have previously been described as transgender. Okay. There was also a comment made that the worsening of mental health, the breakdown of the parent-child relationship, and behaviours that isolate children from their families, non-transgender friends, and mainstream sources of information are particularly concerning. It ended by saying that more research is needed to understand the implications and scope of rapid-onset gender dysphoria. Now, the corrected version of the conclusions were quite different to this. The study was described as descriptive and exploratory, and has now been framed as hypothesis generating rather than hypothesis testing. This means that no solid conclusions about the existence or realness of ROGD can be drawn from the results. But what can be done is some hypotheses for future research around ROGD can be generated. This is very different to the original conclusion. The existence of ROGD is now framed as a potential, but clearly stating it has not been clinically validated. That's a very important point. It's not been clinically validated. Finally, the claims of social media, the worsening of mental health, and the parent-child relationship are all framed much more tentatively and questioningly, and rightly so, because no conclusions can be drawn from these results. So quite a lot of changes. The framing of the study was changed, the claims were pared back massively, and in my opinion, the biggest difference that completely changes the whole scope and the way that this study can be interpreted and used is the fact that it was very clearly stated to be hypothesis generating, not hypothesis testing. This means that conclusions can be made about potential questions to be asked in future research, but conclusions cannot be made about the existence, cause, or anything else about ROGD being an actual thing or about trans youth's experience themselves, seeing as no trans youth were included in this study. But we'll get onto that in a minute. Meaning that this study, the study that has been pushed so hard and used by so many people who want to believe and do believe that ROGD is a real thing, actually has no substance to it and actually cannot be used in the way that it's been used. It is not proof that ROGD is a real thing, and it should not be used to try and prove that ROGD is a real thing. The corrections made such a big difference to the meaning and potential interpretations around the existence of ROGD and the causes, but the damage was already done. People are out there talking about ROGD based on the original paper and way overinflating the results and the meaning of the results and conclusions that can be drawn from this. People are talking about this unsubstantiated term as if it's been scientifically and clinically proven, which it has not. It's actually nothing more than a question mark at this point. The editor of PLOS ONE, the journal the paper was published in, deems that the corrected paper provides a better context than the original, and that this study is a report on parental observations. It is not a clinically validated phenomenon or diagnostic guideline. The editor further apologized to the trans community for the fact that the original was published in the first place, saying that there should have been better context for the research, its framing, and its limitations right from the start. So, that's the difference between the original and the corrected. There's quite a lot. There's a lot to unpack and digest there. But if you're ready, we're going to dive into the criticisms. It's time to dig down into exactly what is wrong with this research and why ROGD is not a real thing, let alone something that anybody should be using to describe or invalidate any trans person or their experience. Overall, an open letter written by the Gender Dysphoria Affirmative Working Group stated that the study has multiple biases and flaws in methodology, and that it's been widely contested as methodologically flawed and unethical, proceeding from an overt ideological bias and is bigotry masquerading as science. In short, and to say it politely, it's a poorly conducted piece of research based heavily on biased personal opinions. So that was just a little overall for you. The first major criticism I want to talk about is bias sampling methods. This is about how participants were recruited, and it set up the results to be biased right from the offset. In the next section, we'll actually discuss further in depth the bias of the actual participant group, but right now we're just going to have a chat about where they were recruited from and why this was a problem. Basically, the parental sample in Lippmann's research was recruited from websites that are known to be hostile towards trans people, and this was seemingly done purposefully by Lippmann, as it stated in the study that the survey link was placed on 3 websites where parents and professionals had been observed to describe rapid-onset gender dysphoria. It was deliberately placed on these websites to deliberately recruit a specific set of parents. You're setting yourself up to find what you think you're going to find because you're actively seeking out participants who will affirm what you're thinking personally. These websites were Transgender Trend, who described themselves as parents, professionals, and academics based in the UK who were concerned about the current trend to diagnose children as transgender. They claim that they're just out to protect kids, and they also claim that there's no evidence that kids can be trans, which is just rubbish. Trans kids exist, come on. The evidence only needs to be is that being trans is something you are born as, meaning that trans adults would need to be trans kids, whether they realised it or not. Other evidence includes the fact that conversion therapy does not work. It does not stop people from being trans. And there are literal trans kids existing out there living their lives. The second website used was Fourth Wave Now, which was set up by a parent whose kid, in their eyes, suddenly came out as trans. It loosely appears to suggest suggests support for conversion therapy for trans people, and states that they believe that other methods of gender dysphoria management should be explored, ignoring the fact that gender-affirming care is the treatment for gender dysphoria, and there's a lot of evidence to back this up. The third site used was Youth Trans Critical Professionals. That does not feel like a title or a name or a sentence, it just feels like 4 random words put together. I feel like that's most of language, but you know what I mean. This one is a private WordPress site that I do not want to access. But usefully, Transgender Trend did a little blog piece on Youth Trans Critical Professionals when it first became a thing. It's basically the same messages as the other two, but this time specifically for professionals. And they say things like young children are being given cross-sex hormones, which they are not. So obviously very biased results are going to be collected from a survey link placed on these 3 websites. You're actively seeking out parents who have actively sought out websites that are hostile towards trans people, so it's very likely that you're coming across parents that do not accept their child as trans, and already have a belief that ROGD is in some way a real concept, and this was specifically looked for in participant eligibility. In the open letter that I mentioned earlier from the Gender Dysphoria Affirmative Working Group, GDA for short, they call out this use of transphobic websites for participant recruitment, stating that any conclusions were therefore based on the beliefs of parents who already believe ROGD is a thing. The corrections for the paper required Lippmann to increase the detail about the recruitment method and the sites used to recruit participants, as this is important to the results. A 2020 critique of Lippmann's study noted that the premise of the study was outlined at the very beginning of the survey, right at the start of the consent form. This is a problem because it motivates specific groups of parents to then take part in the study because they know exactly what's being looked for. It increased the likelihood that those who then took part in the study agreed with the premise of the study and therefore agreed with the existence and the idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria, thus biasing the results. So it's logical that if you're doing an exploratory study to find out if something you think exists does exist, and you actively seek out participants who, by the way, are not even the group of people that you're talking about in your research, as in trans people, but you seek out this group of participants who assume that what you believe is real, then wow, your results might just come back saying that it exists, but that doesn't make it true. I mean, I could have a personal belief that Santa Claus exists, and I could be like, hey, I want to do some research to find out if Santa Claus exists. And you know how I'm going to do that? I'm going to go ask a bunch of 5-year-olds if they believe in Santa Claus. Based on those results from this group of 5-year-olds that I found on a website that gives you Santa Claus's address to send your present list to him, I'm pretty confident that the majority answer would be yes, he exists. And therefore I conclude that yes, Santa exists. But again, doesn't make it true. Seeking out a group of people who you know or strongly suspect agree with your personal belief does not then result in scientific evidence. That's not how it works. Leading on from above, the second major criticism is that the sample itself was biased. So not only were participants recruited from biased sources and primed to take part in the study if they agreed with the premise, but they were also not the target population, and they were not qualified to answer many of the survey questions about the target population. There are also some general points about the narrowness of the participant demographic that are important to note. So a vast majority, as in 80 to 90% of participants, were white mothers, and over 2/3 of participants believed that their child's trans identification was incorrect. I mean, come on. The sample were parents of gender dysphoric youth and adolescents, and as we've already established above, they were recruited via anti-trans websites. The report collected no data on actual trans youth or clinicians. All results were entirely based on the responses of these 250 parents. A major thing to point out is that parents are not qualified to classify anybody's, including their own child's, gender dysphoria, unless of course they receive formal training and have a license to conduct clinical psychiatric diagnoses. It seems highly unlikely that a decent portion, if any, parents met this criteria. Regardless of where they were recruited from though, parents may be able to observe certain things, but there will clearly be many things that they are incapable of accurately reporting on about their child, or knowing how their child specifically feels about certain things. It was determined that parents would not have direct access to their child's mental well-being, whether the child had high expectations of transitioning or not, and the child's opinion on the parent-child relationship. Parents were deemed able to answer questions on the child's age, existing medical diagnoses given by a medical professional in front of the parent, directly observed behaviours by the parent, school performance, and some other factual information. Not only is it clear that parents would not be able to accurately answer the most important questions in this survey, but as conclusions were made based on the beliefs of parents who were already predetermined to support the concept of rapid onset gender dysphoria, then the onset of gender dysphoria in their child would have likely likely been rapid or sudden from the parent's perspective. That doesn't make it actually rapid or sudden for the child. This is especially crucial and important to point out because teens often delay coming out as trans, particularly when they're in a hostile environment and fear rejection from friends and family. I mean, if your parents are frequenting anti-trans websites, I feel like their opinion would not be overly friendly and supporting. Trans youth are often aware of their trans identity long before they come out to their parents, further supporting the idea that from a parent's perspective, gender dysphoria may appear to happen suddenly or rapidly, and that parents are not reliable at reporting their child's experience of gender dysphoria, especially if they are unaccepting. Given that parents involved sought out trans hostile websites, the fear from trans youth seems to be justified, and makes it even more likely that these trans youth would have delayed coming out. So that's the overview of why and how the sample was biased and the impact it can have on the results. Using parental reports and observation, especially from parents who are not accepting of their trans child, is not going to give an accurate reflection of the child's experience with being transgender, or their experience with gender dysphoria, or their friendship group, or their mental health. Even accepting parents would struggle to accurately answer these questions about their child, just as anybody would struggle to answer accurately questions that are specifically about how a person's feeling, how they have felt, and what they do in their day-to-day life. People don't share everything with everybody else. The results and conclusions of the original paper therefore fall apart in robustness based purely on this sample bias. But we're still going to go into some further reasons to just confirm the inability of Lippmann's research to be used in any kind of clinical or diagnostic sense, or to even state that rapid onset gender dysphoria is a thing. So the next bit is the use of non-validated survey questions and overblown results. So this is to do with the actual questions that parents were asked within the survey. Lippmann asked parents to perform 2 diagnoses of gender dysphoria on their children, using the DSM-5 criteria for gender dysphoria. Except she simplified or adapted the language in these measurements for the use in the survey without methodologically validating them. Lippmann also generally used non-validated measures throughout the paper to support the study premise. This is poor practice in research, and it means that there's a lack of reliable and internally valid measures. Therefore, validity of statistical conclusions and inferences made about relationships between variables is questionable and critically undermined. Generally as well, the survey questions and measures did not follow a standard Likert scale and were inconsistent with each other. This makes it really difficult to compare them to one another. This is also poor practice. Overall, results and conclusions were way overblown, as we've already seen in the corrections. As no data was collected from actual trans youth or adolescents, or no clinicians, results cannot and do not in any way validate the existence of rapid onset gender dysphoria. No conclusions should be drawn about ROGD based on this study. The final point to make about criticisms before we move on to the impact of this research and the actual real results around rapid onset gender dysphoria is that Lippmann was pre-warned about the quality of her research. As mentioned earlier, at the time that she conducted this initial piece of research, she had no experience working with transgender youth and adolescents. Members of the GDA attended sessions where she presented preliminary results on this paper. Those members, along with others who attended those sessions, reported that during those sessions, Lippmann was given extensive critique on the poor quality of her research. But she made no attempt to address these issues in the final paper, suggesting that she places ideology over scientific rigor and failed to acknowledge or account for any skew or bias that had been introduced into the research. Not only did she appear to ignore the advice and critiques of others, including others that specialized in an area that she didn't, she also seemingly ignored the wealth of evidence that exists that runs contrary to her belief and the belief of her participants, and overall the research she conducted. We'll go through some of this evidence in a little bit, but right now I want to talk to you about the impact that this research has had, because oh my, is it bad, big, and completely unjustified. Honestly, despite the lack of the quality in this research, the impact of this descriptive, exploratory, hypothesis generating, poorly executed, heavily biased study have been immeasurable and hugely widespread. The term ROGD has taken on a life of its own and is used constantly by those spreading transphobic rhetoric, and by those, it's the same people really, who are trying to prevent access to gender-affirming care for transgender youth and adolescents. Sites called Parents of ROGD Kids have appeared, who describe themselves as a group of parents whose children have suddenly decided they identify strongly with the opposite sex. They refer to ROGD as a recent epidemic among vulnerable youth. As I'm saying all of these impacts, please bear in mind the criticisms and how poor and how biased and how wrong this research is, and how the conclusions cannot be made. It's just mind-boggling. Anyway, going back to parents of ROGD kids, they're also skeptical of the gender-affirming approach and seemingly choose to ignore the massive amount of evidence that supports this approach and all the medical and professional organisations and boards that support it. They clearly think that they know more than the trans people themselves and the clinicians. Many places, from political to religious groups, have wrongly and misleadingly described ROGD as an established phenomenon. It was mentioned by J.K. Rowling in her now infamous essay, where Rowling defended Lippmann and her research. Abigail Schreier's book Irreversible Damage endorses ROGD, and the book is basically based on the concept of rapid onset gender dysphoria. The concept of ROGD is also frequently used by legislative bodies across the United States who are trying to restrict and take away the rights of trans youth and adolescents and their access to gender-affirming care. It is dangerous and unfair to make claims based on this low quality of research that can lead to the prevention of transgender youth being correctly diagnosed with gender dysphoria and receiving the appropriate care. And honestly, this is just scratching the surface of the impact that this has had. ROGD is something that is used so frequently by those with transphobic views. It's caused fear about being trans being catchable and is used to push political agendas. Seriously, as a trans person on the internet, ROGD as the term or just as the concept comes up all the time, constantly, from people with transphobic views. It is one of the biggest things used that gives transphobes the feeling that they have scientific support behind them, when it's literally something that has no evidence. It is not a diagnostic classification. It is not a clinical term, nor is it being considered for entry into the DSM, but yet it's still being used in attempts to change policy and access to healthcare. The World Professional Association for Transgender Health, the WPATH, has stated that ROGD is nothing more than an acronym created to describe a proposed phenomenon, as well as stating that ROGD is not a medical entity recognized by any major professional association. Something that has been so strongly and widely rejected by the people that actually know what they're talking about should never have the impact that ROGD has been able to have. And at the end of the day, it all boils down to transphobia. People were desperate to have something to cling on to justify their bigotry, and ROGD was the perfect thing at the perfect time. People with those views don't actually care that it is a bad piece of research that in no way supports what they're saying. People just jumped on a term that gave them a legitimate justification to be transphobic, when in reality, there is no justification. So what are the real results? I particularly like this bit that I found about rapid onset gender dysphoria. So, the evidence of ROGD can politely be described as very low quality, but no quality evidence is more accurate a description. A 2021 study confirmed that there is no evidence for the existence of rapid onset gender dysphoria, that it is harmful and it perpetrates fear and harm towards the transgender community. This study did actually include clinical data from actual transgender youth about their gender dysphoria. Across youth from 10 different clinics, they tested 13 factors that would be consistent with rapid onset gender dysphoria. And guess what? They found nothing to support ROGD being a distinct clinical phenomenon. And factors such as having supportive friends and family did not significantly impact gender identity. It also showed that more recent knowledge of gender was not associated with having online friends, trans friends, or mental health issues, meaning that the things that ROGD claims can lead to actually being trans do not lead to being trans. It is not social contagion. And that 80% of participants had known they were trans from before the age of 14. Basically, a study conducting research into ROGD the way that it should be done found no evidence for its existence. Then I just want to talk about some general findings into trans youth and transitioning, because supporters of ROGD tend to also want to limit the access to gender-affirming care and support for trans youth. So just some findings to show why this is very bad, as in limiting the access is very bad. One study found that 93% of peer-reviewed studies showed that transitioning improved well-being, and no studies showed a decline in well-being with transitioning. At worst, it gave a neutral outcome, and that was for 7%. Rates of regret are documented as being minuscule. Extensive findings show that if transgender people have supportive environments, it leads them to having no increased mental health issues as compared to cisgender people. And having supportive parents leads to better physical and mental health. Whereas increased rates of poorer mental well-being among transgender people have been found in those who are in unsupportive environments, including those using disaffirming approaches, including those advocated by proponents of ROGD. Transgender youth have the best outcomes when they are affirmed in their gender, through support by their families and access to the appropriate mental health and medical care. So basically, having trans friends doesn't make you trans, having a supportive environment doesn't make you trans. You're trans either way, but your well-being and your mental health and your physical health will be better if you're supported. So therefore, there is no harm in supporting somebody who is trans. It doesn't make them more trans and make them trans in the first place, but not supporting someone who's trans really does have a very negative impact on them. One extra thing to mention here is that a lot of the panic and outrage among trans youth seems to be over AFAB trans youth, so those assigned female at birth, where it's been deemed there's been a massive spike in AFAB trans youth coming out as trans. In Littman's study conclusion, she stated that AFAB youth may be more susceptible to ROGD, and this would explain why there is an increase in this demographic coming out as trans. So not only did the conclusions try and make it sound like ROGD was real, they also tried to make it sound like conclusions could be drawn off of this thing that isn't real being real. Like, it's just so multi-layered and so multi-layered in a wrong way. In reality, a 2022 study showed that overall the number of transgender youth went down between 2017 to 2019, and that the sex assigned at birth ratio of transgender youth does not favour those who are AFAB. This lack of increase in AFAB transgender youth is inconsistent with the conclusions of ROGD, and specifically the social contagion element around ROGD. Finally, on top of a wide array of quality research not supporting anything to do with rapid onset gender dysphoria, many professional and medical bodies have also rejected ROGD as a term. In 2021, the Coalition for the Advancement and Application of Psychology Science, CAAPS, released a statement calling for the elimination of the concept of ROGD from clinical and diagnostic use. This statement was co-signed by the American Psychiatric Association, American Psychological Association, Society of Behavioral Medicine, Association of Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies, and the National Association of School Psychologists, and as you can see, many, many more. The American Academy of Pediatrics stated that there is no evidence that being transgender in itself is inherently linked to lower well-being. Instead, this is attributed towards internal conflicts between one's identity and one's appearance, limited availability of healthcare, discrimination, stigma, and social rejection. This goes against claims made by Littman and means that trans people's well-being is not poorer because they are trans, but because there is a lot of social stigma around being trans. There's also poor access to healthcare and, gender dysphoria. But funnily enough, access to gender-affirming healthcare reduces gender dysphoria. And so therefore, if people were more accepting of trans people and access to affirming healthcare was better and easier, then, oh my goodness, trans people would have better well-being. The AAP is one of many organisations that support trans people in healthcare, as in they support the gender affirmative approach. Whilst I'm saying this, you're going to be seeing a list of some other organisations that support this too, and this isn't even all of them. There are so many. I cannot stress enough, the affirmative approach is the way to treat trans people. It reduces gender dysphoria, it increases well-being, and the concept of rapid onset gender dysphoria and the conclusions made around it are just damaging. In conclusion, my little summary. A methodologically flawed and poor piece of very biased research was conducted, where data was collected from a biased and primed sample of participants. And these participants were not even people that the research was actually about, but instead parents recruited from anti-trans websites. Before starting the study, participants were made aware of the premise of the study and the intention, and were specifically recruited as parents who believed that their child's gender dysphoria was sudden. Parents are not qualified to diagnose anybody else's gender dysphoria, and they're particularly not qualified in any way to identify a subtype of gender dysphoria in anybody else. The results of this study in no way lend themselves to an adjustment in diagnosis or treatment of gender dysphoric children, or adolescents, or anyone, and are not results on the existence of ROGD. They do not allow for the use of rapid onset gender dysphoria in diagnostic and clinical settings, as Littman's study was descriptive only and based on personal views of gender dysphoria in children. It is in no way robust enough to draw any conclusions, and at most the results allow for further questions to be asked around rapid onset gender dysphoria, which they have been, and in which rapid onset gender dysphoria has been disproven. Littman's 2018 study made a fundamental error of reports of descriptive studies by overstepping the study design. The research and the term ROGD has been thoroughly rejected by major medical boards and professional bodies, and goes against the robust scientific evidence we have in in supporting transgender youth in their identities and in gaining access to gender-affirming healthcare. Unfortunately though, Lippmann's research has gone on to do so much damage to the trans community through various media-based, organizational, personal, and other avenues. So that's why I wanted to make this comprehensive breakdown of rapid onset gender dysphoria. I really hope this can help you going forward if you need to dispel it to anybody else, or if you want to pass this video on to somebody who doesn't understand. And I hope that if you came into this not understanding or being on the fence about it, or maybe thinking it was a real thing, it's now helped you understand the reality of rapid onset gender dysphoria and how it's not real and how it is very dangerous and it's caused a lot of harm and continues to do so. That was a long one. Thank you for sticking through it. If you did, I really appreciate it. Again, I really hope this video can be helpful. Let me know in the comments down below. Think about giving it a thumbs up and subscribing if you want to, but no pressure. And yeah, as always, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Much love. Bye.